Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program this evening. And I say program because in addition to the wonderful privilege of hearing an address by Professor Gordon Wood tonight, the university is pleased to honor his outstanding academic contributions by presenting him with an honorary degree immediately following his talk. And following that honorary degree presentation, law professor Scott Gerber, who more than any other single individual is responsible for bringing Professor Wood to ONU, will lead a question and answer period. On a personal note, I want to express my appreciation to Professor Wood for being here tonight. He is one of my history heroes, and I am as excited as a child on Christmas morning about his appearance. Speaking of Christmas, just before that holiday in 2009, I made it known in our family that a great gift idea for me would be Gordon Wood's latest book, Empire of Liberty. I was thrilled that Santa heard my wish. What an insightful history of the early years of our republic. It is now my pleasure to introduce ONU Professor of Law Scott Gerber, who will introduce our speaker. Like our speaker, Professor Gerber is also a prolific scholar. He has written several books, including A Distinct Judicial Power, The Origins of an Independent Judiciary, 1606 to 1787, published in 2011 by the prestigious Oxford University Press, and First Principles, The Jurisprudence of Clarence Thomas, published in 1999 by the New York University Press. In addition, Professor Gerber has published numerous articles in law reviews and peer-reviewed journals. He has clerked for U.S. District Judge Ernest Torres in the District of Rhode Island and practiced with the Boston-based law firm Bingham & McCutcheon before joining the law faculty here in 2001. He is a frequent presenter at colleges and universities across the country and has appeared on C-SPAN to discuss his book on Justice Thomas. Professor Gerber is serving his third two-year term on the Ohio Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He holds both a PhD in politics and a JD from the University of Virginia and a BA from the College of William and Mary. We are grateful to Scott for all of his efforts to make Professor Wood's appearance possible. I am pleased both to introduce and to publicly thank Professor Scott Gerber.
Well, I didn't expect that, I'll tell you that. And I appreciate it, though. So thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to be introducing tonight's distinguished speaker. Gordon S. Wood is Alva Oway University Professor Emeritus at Brown University. He received his BA degree from Tufts University and his PhD from Harvard University. He taught at Harvard and the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. He is the author of many works, including The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 through 1787, which was published in 1969, and which won the Bancroft Prize and the John H. Dunning Prize in 1970. He's also the author of The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which was published in 1992, and which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize in 1993. The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin, which was published in 2004, was awarded the Julia Ward Howard Prize by the Boston Authors Club in 2005. His book, Revolutionary Characters, What Made the Founders Different, was published in 2006, and his book, The Purpose of the Past, Reflections on the Uses of History, was published in 2008. His volume in the Oxford History of the United States entitled Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 through 1815, was published in 2009, and it was given the Association of American Publishers Award for History and Biography in 2009, the History Book Prize by the New York Historical Society for 2010, and the Society of the Cincinnati History Prize in 2010. In 2011, he was awarded a National Humanities Medal by the President of the United States and the Churchill Bell by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. In 2011, he was also the recipient of the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Award from the Society of American Historians. In 2012, he received an award from the John Carter Brown Library and the John F. Kennedy Medal from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Wood is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. As President DiBiasio will describe in a brief ceremony immediately after Professor Wood's remarks and shortly before this evening's question and answer session, Professor Wood is unquestionably America's leading historian of the American Revolution, the Constitution, and the early American Republic. I would like to close my introductory remarks by also mentioning that Professor Wood has had more impact on my own scholarship than any other scholar. Whether it be one of the first articles I ever published many years ago now about the political philosophy of the American Revolution, or my recent Oxford University Press book about the origins of judicial independence in America, I always seem to be responding to a challenge that Professor Wood has issued to the world of ideas. Many other academics, be they law professors such as myself, historians such as Professor Wood, or political scientists, can say the same. More important than any of that, however, Professor Wood, Gordon, is one of the nicest and most generous people I have had the pleasure of meeting in academic life. As a mutual friend of Gordon's and mine, historian George Athenbillius put it recently when I mentioned that Gordon was coming to Ohio Northern, Gordon is a human being in the best sense of that word. His willingness to spend so much time with us at ONU this week is a testament to that fact, and the entire ONU community appreciates it very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Gordon Wood.
Well, thank you, Scott, for that very generous introduction. The title of my talk is The Revolutionary Origins of the Civil War, and we're celebrating over these past couple of years the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Now, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on a platform of preventing the extension of slavery into the West, the southern states felt their way of life was threatened, and they seceded from the Union. Since many states, including those of New England, had talked of seceding from the Union at various times in the antebellum period following the Revolution, explaining the secession of the southern states is not a major historical problem. I think we can fairly easily account for why the southern states seceded. What is more difficult to explain is why the northern states cared. Why was the North willing to go to war to preserve the Union? It was not because the North was bent on the abolition of slavery, at least not at first. Many Northerners, of course, were opposed to slavery, but what they were especially opposed to was the extension of slavery into the West. Northerners were opposed to the extension of slavery into the West because they knew that slavery would create a society incompatible with the one they wanted for their children and grandchildren, who they presumed would settle in the West. But this was not the only reason why the North cared enough for the Union to engage in a long and bloody war that cost Northerners several 100,000 lives. To fully understand why the North cared enough to resist the secession of the southern states, we have to go back to the Revolution and the ideas and ideals that came out of it. Lincoln's words, which have been aptly called his sword, were crucial in sustaining the struggle to maintain the Union. With his words, he reached back to the Revolution to draw inspiration and understanding of what the Civil War meant, both for the nation and the world. He knew what the Revolution was about and what it implied, not just for Americans, but for all humanity. The United States was a new republican nation in a world of monarchies, a grand experiment in self-government, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The American people of 1860, said Lincoln, deeply felt the moral principle of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And this moral principle made them one with the founders. In Lincoln's words, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, he said, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link these patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. Now, with words like these, drawing on the meaning of the American Revolution, Lincoln expressed what many Americans felt about themselves and the future of all mankind. Liberty and equality, he said, were promised not just to the people of this country, but to the world for all future time. The Revolution, he said, gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance in the race of life. But if the American experiment in self-government failed, then his hope for the future would be lost. Spreading freedom and democracy around the world had been an explicit goal of the Revolution. It was what turned the Americans' little colonial rebellion into a world historical event, important for everyone throughout the world. Americans believed that the French Revolution of 1789 was a direct consequence of their revolution, and Lafayette thought so too, which is why he sent the key to the Bastille being the prison that became a symbol of the Ancien regime. He sent the key to the Bastille to George Washington, and of course, as you many may know, that key hangs today in Mount Vernon. But all the 19th century efforts in creating democracy in Europe had ended in failure. Americans had seen the French Revolution spiral into tyranny. All attempts by Europeans to create democracies in the revolutions of 1848 had been crushed. By the 1860s, as Lincoln pointed out, the United States was a lone beacon of democratic freedom in a world of monarchies. Napoleon III was on the throne of France. On American shoulders alone rested the survival of the possibility of self-government. It was indeed the last best hope for the future of democracy. That responsibility, I believe, was what sustained Lincoln throughout the war. A war, as he said in his Gettysburg Address, that was testing whether this nation, dedicated to liberty, equality, and self-government, could long endure. In commemorating the Civil War, which is what we're doing over these past 2 years, we commemorate the Revolution. Indeed, in an important sense, Northern success in the Civil War was the culmination of the Revolution. Now, how did this nation that had once been united enough to defeat the greatest power in the world fall apart and engage in a long and bloody civil war? The seeds of the Civil War were probably sown when the first slaves were brought to Virginia in the 17th century. But no one sensed that at the time. Even in 1776, when Americans declared their independence from Great Britain, no one foresaw a civil war in this newly created United States. To be sure, the 13 separate North American colonies were not very united. That they were able to come together at all in 1776 was something of a miracle. Before the Revolution, the British colonies had little sense of connectedness with one another. Most of them had closer ties with London and Britain than they had with one another. Until the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774, more of its members had been to London than had been to Philadelphia. It was Great Britain and its policies that created the colonists' sense of being Americans. In fact, the British officials were the ones who first defined the colonists as Americans. Until the last moment before independence, the colonists thought of themselves as Englishmen. It was British tyranny expressed in the Coercive Acts of 1774 that made the colonists like Patrick Henry declare that they were not Virginians or New Yorkers, but Americans. The long and bloody war with Great Britain, in which all parts of the country suffered at one time or another, was a searing experience. In fact, more Americans died in that war in proportion to population than in any other war in our history, with the exception, of course, of the Civil War, in which both sides were Americans. No wonder that the Revolution bred an overwhelming sense of unity. This glorious cause, as they called it, this glorious cause of the Revolution united all Americans. The Revolution and the beliefs and ideals that came out of it, liberty, equality, self-government, created national bonds that were not easily broken. Indeed, they are the bonds that I believe still hold us together and make us think of ourselves as a single people. Of course, Americans at the time of the Revolution were aware of sectional differences, differences that were essentially based on slavery. Although slavery in 1776 legally existed in all the new Republican states, 90% of the nearly 500,000 African-American slaves, constituting about a fifth of the total population of the country, this fifth lived in the South, working in the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake or in the rice swamps of South Carolina and Georgia. Now, these southern states were obviously different from those in the North. In 1776, John Adams worried that the South was too aristocratic for the kind of popular Republican government he advocated in his pamphlet, Thoughts on Government. But he was surprised to learn that the southern states more or less did adopt the kind of popular mixed government that he had suggested in the pamphlet, and he expressed relief in seeing the pride of the haughty brought down a little by the Revolution. Of course, what Adams was referring to was the slaveholding society dominated by planter aristocrats that contrasted with the more egalitarian small farm societies of the North, especially in the states of New England. But slavery was not inconsequential in the North. Black slaves made up nearly 7% of the population of New Jersey and 14% of the population of New York City. Nearly 12% of my own state, Rhode Island, was composed of slaves. It was not just the Southern revolutionary leaders, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and so on, who owned slaves. So did many of the Northern leaders. Boston's John Hancock, New York's Robert Livingston, and Philadelphia's John Dickinson were also slaveholders. On the eve of the Revolution, the mayor of Philadelphia possessed 31 slaves. Nonetheless, the sectional differences were obvious. In the mid-1780s, the Boston merchant Stephen Higginson was convinced that in their habits, manners, and commercial interests, the southern and northern states are not only very dissimilar, but in many instances directly opposed. Thomas Jefferson tended to agree, and in 1785, he outlined to a French friend his sense of the differences between the people of the two sections, which he attributed mostly to differences of climate. Slavery was not something he liked to talk about. The Northerners were, as he said, cool, sober, industrious, persevering, independent, zealous of their liberties, and just to those of others, interested, chicaney, superstitious, and hypocritical in their religion. By contrast, said Jefferson, the Southerners were fiery, voluptuary, indolent, unsteady, independent, zealous for their own liberties, but trampling on those of others, generous, candid, and without attachment or pretensions to any religion but that of the heart. Now, despite his sensitivity to the differences, however, Jefferson and most other Southerners did not as yet see these sectional differences as endangering national unity. Now, since we know how the story turned out, it's easy to read back signs of what we know will happen. But I think it's a mistake to see too many anticipations of the Civil War in the Revolutionary decades. In the 1780s, leaders from both the South and the North came to realize that the Confederation, this League of States based on a treaty, created in 1777, not ratified till 1781, they came to see that this Confederation was not working out and would have to be reformed or scrapped altogether and replaced by a new constitution. The slaveholding state of Virginia took the lead in this reform and was supported by national-minded leaders from the northern states. The differences that rose in the Constitutional Convention and later in the 1790s were differences of ideology, not sectional differences between North and South. The delegates differed essentially over the strength of the national government vis-a-vis the states. The split in the Constitutional Convention was essentially between the large states that wanted proportional representation in both houses of the Congress and the small states that feared being overwhelmed by these more populous states. James Madison of Virginia and James Wilson of Pennsylvania eventually had to surrender to the wishes of the small states and accept the so-called Connecticut Compromise that gave equal representation of 2 senators from each state. The issue, in other words, did not divide along sectional lines. Although at one point Madison tried to suggest that the real division in the convention was between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, everyone knew that this was a tactical feint designed by Madison to get the convention off of the large small state division that was undermining his desperate desire, and I mean desperate desire, for proportional representation in both houses. So fearful was he of the power of the state legislatures to vitiate national authority by each state legislature electing 2 senators that he regarded the Connecticut Compromise not as a compromise, but as a major defeat. The party division that arose in the 1790s was not between North and South. The difference between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans was over the nature of the national government and respective support for the French Revolution, or opposition to the French Revolution. Although the leadership and base of the Republican Party were located in the South, the party was not and could not be exclusively a sectional party. The Northern Republicans were a very important and increasingly dynamic part of the party. Jefferson rightly never saw himself as the leader of a sectional party. He was, as he said, the leader of the world's best hope, a popular democratic Republican government that was something new under the sun, and that promised eventually, he said, to ameliorate the condition of man over a great portion of the globe. It's no wonder that Lincoln paid all honor to Jefferson. His vision was essentially Jefferson's vision. Still, there was the serpent of slavery lurking in this Arcadian garden of yeoman farmers that threatened to destroy the democratic Republican dream. At the outset, the revolutionary leaders were well aware of this serpent. They knew from the beginning that slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the Revolution. Indeed, it was the Revolution that made slavery a problem for Americans and for the rest of the world, actually. Before the mid-18th century, most Americans, like the rest of the world for thousands of years, largely took slavery for granted as the lowest and most degraded status in a hierarchical world of degrees of unfreedom and dependency. And few colonists had bothered to criticize it. But the Revolution changed everything. All the revolutionary leaders realized that there was something painfully inconsistent between their talk of freedom for themselves and the owning of black slaves. If all men were created equal, as all enlightened persons were now saying, then what justification could there be for holding Africans in slavery? Since the American colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black, does it follow, asked James Otis of Massachusetts in 1764, does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black? The revolutionary rhetoric made the contradiction excruciating for many Americans, both in the North and in the South. Northerners like Samuel Cook in his Massachusetts election sermon of 1770 confess that in tolerating black slavery, we, the patrons of liberty, have dishonored the Christian name and degraded human nature nearly to a level with the beasts. Prominent slaveholding Southerners like Jefferson agreed and declared that the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in these colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. He always blamed the English for introducing slavery. Now, given the mounting sense of inconsistency between the revolutionary ideals and the holding of people in bondage, it is not surprising that the first anti-slave convention in the history of the world was held in Philadelphia in 1775. Now, if the revolutionary leaders, these founders who were otherwise as so enlightened, so far-sighted, knew that slavery contradicted everything the revolution was about, why didn't they do more to end the institution that they claimed to abhor? Now, this is the question many historians, of course, are asking today. The reason, I think, is that they didn't act more forcefully was that many of them, perhaps most, thought that time was on the side of abolition. As incredible as it may seem to us, who know what they could not know, that is, their future, the leaders tended to believe that slavery was on its last legs and was headed for eventual extinction. Dr. Benjamin Rush was convinced that the desire to abolish the institution prevails in our councils among all ranks in every province. With hostility towards slavery mounting everywhere among the enlightened in the Atlantic world, Rush in 1774 predicted that there will not be a Negro slave in North America in 40 years. Enlightened Virginians also assumed that slavery could not long endure. Jefferson told a French correspondent in 1786 that there were in the Virginia legislature men of virtue and talent enough to propose and to move toward the gradual emancipation of slaves. To be sure, he said, they saw that the moment of emancipation has not yet arrived, but, he added, with the spread of light and liberality among the slaveholders, that moment was coming. Slavery could simply not stand against the relentless march of liberty and progress. That the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 was scrupulous in not mentioning slaves, slavery, or Negroes in the final draft of the Constitution seemed to point to a future without the shameful institution. If the revolutionary dream that slavery would naturally die away had been realized, of course, there would have been no Civil War. This illusion that slavery would die a natural death led the revolutionary leaders to table efforts to abolish the institution. They thought that in time it would simply disappear. But slavery in the United States was not on its last legs at all. Predictions of its demise could not have been more wrong. Far from being doomed, American slavery, in fact, was on the verge of its greatest expansion. How could the revolutionary leaders have been so mistaken? How could they have deceived themselves so completely? For a full generation, the nation's leaders lived with the illusion that the institution of slavery was declining and on its way to being eliminated. Of all the illusions they had about the future, this was the greatest. But the founders' self-deception and mistaken optimism were understandable, for they wanted to believe the best, and initially there was evidence that slavery was in fact being eliminated and dying out. The northern states where slavery was not deeply rooted, of course, in the economy or society, the northern states began immediately to attack the institution, and by 1804, every northern state had provided for the eventual end of slavery. The South, where slavery was much more deeply entrenched in both the economy and the society, the South was slower to act. But even in the South, there were encouraging signs of movement against the institution, especially in Virginia. Now, Virginia was no ordinary state. It was by far the most populous state. Indeed, by itself, it made up a fifth of the population of the entire nation. It was as well the largest state in territory and the richest state of all. It's not surprising that 4 out of the first 5 presidents were Virginians, and that the working model for the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was the Virginia Plan. During the first few decades of the new republic, Virginia dominated the nation as no state ever has since. As Virginia went, so went the nation. And there were signs in the 1770s and 1780s that Virginia was trying to do something about slavery. If Virginia could abolish slavery, it was assumed that the rest of the South would surely follow. In Virginia, the harsh black codes of the early 18th century had fallen into neglect, and by the time of the Revolution, fraternization between whites and black slaves had become more common, both in sporting events and in horse races and so on, and in religion. We even have cases of white mixed congregations, black and white, with black slave preachers. The growing of wheat instead of tobacco in the Upper South, in Virginia in particular, was changing the nature of slavery in the Upper South, and many of the planters, now calling themselves farmers, began hiring out their slaves, suggesting to some that slavery might eventually be replaced by wage labor. Other evidence from the Upper South seemed to reinforce the idea that slavery was on its way to extinction. What could be more conspicuous, a more conspicuous endorsement of the anti-slave cause than having the College of William and Mary in 1791 confer an honorary degree on the celebrated British abolitionist Granville Sharp? It's an extraordinary fact. That there were more anti-slave societies created in the South than in the North was bound to make people feel that the South was moving in the same direction of gradual emancipation as the North. In Virginia and Maryland, some of these anti-slave societies brought freedom suits in the state courts that led to some piecemeal emancipation. These suits may not seem very meaningful by our standards, I suppose, but by the standards of the 18th century, they were significant. If slaves could demonstrate that they had maternal Indian or white ancestors, just one, they could be freed. And hearsay evidence was often enough to convince the courts. Whole families, recalled one sympathetic observer, were often liberated by a single verdict, the fate of one relative deciding the fate of many. By 1796, nearly 30 freedom suits were pending in Virginia courts. By the 1790s, the free black population in the Upper South had increased to over 30,000. By 1810, the free blacks in the area numbered over 94,000. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Henry Lawrence, and St. George Tucker publicly deplored the injustice of slavery, from that moment, declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798, from that moment, the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. Everywhere, even in South Carolina, slaveholders began to feel defensive about slavery and began to sense a public pressure against the institution they had never felt before. In the aftermath of the Revolution, whites in Charleston expressed squeamishness now about the evils of slavery, especially the public trading and punishment of slaves. In the 1780s, some of the Carolinian masters expressed a growing reluctance to break up families and even began manumitting their slaves, freeing more slaves in that decade of the 1780s than had been freed in the previous 3 decades. What helped to convince many people in the North that slavery's last days were numbered was the promised ending of the despicable slave trade in 1808. Almost everywhere in the New World, slavery was dependent on the continual importations of slaves from Africa. Although this need for slaves from Africa was no longer true of the Upper South, South Carolina and Georgia were still importing slaves. The fact that the Deep South and the rest of the New World, the South America and the Caribbean, needed slave importations to maintain the institution deluded many Americans into believing that slavery in America was also dependent on the international slave trade, and that ending that slave trade would eventually end slavery itself. Those who held out this hope, of course, were utterly wrong. They simply did not appreciate how demographically different North American slavery was from that in South America and in the Caribbean. The mortality rate in Brazil, for example, was 80% of children born died before they reached adulthood. So they had to keep importing. People who thought that ending the slave trade would end slavery were blind to the fact that in most areas of North America, the slaves were approximating the growth of the whites, nearly doubling in number every 20 to 25 years, which, by the way, was the fastest growing population in any part of the Atlantic world. Northerners had little or no appreciation that slavery in the South was a healthy, vigorous, and expansive institution. As far as they were concerned, the Virginia and Maryland planters, who had more slaves than they knew what to do with, were enthusiastically supporting an end to the international slave trade as the first major step in eliminating the institution of slavery itself. This assault on the overseas slave trade appeared to align the Chesapeake planters with the anti-slave forces in the North and confused many Northerners about the real intentions of the Upper South, which in fact, of course, was in the business of exporting its surplus of slaves to the Deep South, particularly to the new territories of Mississippi and Alabama. All these developments misled many Americans and allowed them to postpone dealing with the issue. Like John Adams and Oliver Ellsworth, who was the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they thought that when the importation of slaves was cut off, white laborers would become so numerous that the need for slaves would disappear. Slavery, said Ellsworth, in time will not be a speck in the country. In the meantime, the initial differences between the two sections were rapidly and dramatically increasing, becoming much more severe. During the 3 or 4 decades following the Revolution, the North and South grew much farther apart. Both sections were American and Republican. Both professed a similar rhetoric of liberty and popular government, but beneath the surface, they were fast becoming very different places, with different cultures, different values, one coming to honor common labor as the supreme human activity, the other continuing to think of labor, manual labor, in traditional terms as mean and despicable and fit only for slaves. When on the eve of the Civil War, the South complained that it had remained true to the 18th century republic and that it was the North that had changed, it was absolutely correct. In the years immediately following the Revolution, the North was radically transformed, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. It was not that the population growth in the two sections was different, although by 1810 New York had outstripped Virginia as the most populous state. It was the varied nature of the growth in the North. The northern states were building turnpikes and canals, creating banks and corporations, and greasing the growing internal trade with paper money to an extent not duplicated in the southern states. Everywhere in the northern states, farm families were busy buying and selling with one another. The society was still predominantly rural and agricultural, with no large manufacturing cities, as in England, but in many northern towns, people seemed to be doing everything but farming. By 1815, even the tiny town of Mount Pleasant, Ohio, so there is still a Mount Pleasant, a tiny town on the eastern part of Ohio near Steubenville. It had a population of only 500 people, but it had several dozen artisans and manufacturing shops, including 3 saddlers. It's 500 people. 3 saddlers, 3 hatters, 4 blacksmiths, 4 weavers, 6 shoemakers, 3 cabinet makers, 1 baker, 1 apothecary, 2 wagon makers, 2 tanneries, 1 wool carding machine maker, 2 wool carding machinists, 1 wool spinning machinist, 1 flax spinner, and 1 nail factory. Within a 6-mile radius of this little Ohio town, of its 500 people, were 9 merchant mills, 2 grist mills, 12 sawmills, 1 paper mill, 1 woolen factory, and 2 fulling mills. There's nothing like that in the South. Nothing like this little Ohio town in the South. And when Tocqueville came and stood on the banks of the Ohio and looked over, a student standing in Ohio looked over at Kentucky, he saw a very different world and describes it as very different. The North, Ohio in particular, was becoming the most highly commercialized society in the world. The North was becoming increasingly dominated by hosts of middling people, commercial farmers, mechanics, clerks, teachers, businessmen, and industrious, self-trained would-be professionals who celebrated work and the making of money to a degree unprecedented in the entire Western world. This celebration of labor, especially manual labor, was important. Ever since Aristotle, leisured aristocrats and the professional classes had held labor, especially manual labor, and the making of money in contempt. Even someone who ran a business, say a printing business with 20 employees, was nonetheless considered to be involved with manual labor and thus contemptible. Such men who worked for a living, Aristotle had said, could never possess virtue and could never exercise political leadership. Perhaps nothing separated the North and South more than this contrasting view of labor they had. The South, dominated as it was by leisured slaveholding planters, could scarcely conceive of labor as anything but despicable and shameful. Slavery, as it had for centuries, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, required a culture that held labor in contempt. Scorn for work and the holding of slaves were two sides of the same coin. The North developed very differently. In the several decades following the Revolution, the middling men of the North, using the egalitarian rhetoric of the Revolution, launched a wholesale campaign against aristocrats or would-be aristocrats who had scorned them for ages. They urged each other to shed their earlier political apathy and accused all those gentlemen who, as one critic said, were not under the necessity of getting their bread by industry, of being parasites and of living off the labor of honest farmers and mechanics. These leisured aristocrats who do not labor but who enjoy in luxury the fruits of labor, critics said, had no right to decide the laws as they had in the past. Of course, the American aristocrats these middling people attacked were not European aristocrats. In the eyes of these middling sorts, these leisured aristocrats were probably what we would call today elites, mostly members of the professions, lawyers, judges, physicians, clergymen, government officials, anyone who was not involved with manual labor in one form or another. In the eyes of the middling sorts, artisans, clerks, businessmen, these elites seemed to do no real work. This celebration of labor inevitably made the South, with its leisured aristocracy supported by slavery, seem increasingly anomalous. In reaction, of course, the Southern aristocrats began emphasizing their cavalier status in contrast to the money-grubbing Northern Yankees. They began claiming that they were the only true gentlemen left in America. It was not just the brutal fact of slavery that mattered, it was what slavery did to the society. Slavery in the South tended to create a different economy, a different politics and culture from the North. While the North was coming to value labor as necessary and fit for all social ranks, much of the white population of the South was becoming more and more contemptuous of work and more desirous of acquiring the leisure that slavery seemed to afford. Indeed, so great was the white cult of indolence that some Southerners began to worry about the discrepancy between an industrious North and a lethargic South. Where there is Negro slavery, one concerned Virginian told Madison, there will be laziness, carelessness, and wastefulness. Not as much among the slaves, he said, as among the white masters. This Virginian even claimed that our intelligent Negroes are far superior in mind, morals, and manners than those who are placed in authority over them. The South grew in population and prospered, but its culture and society remained traditional, and traditional in many ways. During the antebellum decades, when the North was commercially exploding, the South remained essentially what it had been in the 18th century, a staple-producing slaveholding society. Cotton replaced tobacco and rice as the principal staple, but the society, the economy, and much of the politics remained roughly what they had been in the 18th century. Slavery determined the organization of the society. Now, when I read the book on Southern politics by the Harvard political scientist V.O. Key in the 1960s, at the same time that I was studying colonial history, I was struck by how similar still the Southern political world of the 1930s that Key described in his book, how similar it was to the Southern world of the 18th century that I was finding out about in my own studies. The Southern states in the 1930s that Key described relied on mostly appointed local officials in county courts, with the state legislatures very much in control of government. In the 1930s, there was no slavery left in the South, but politically, the Southern states had not changed much since the 18th century. They still believed in minimal government, low taxation, and allowing county court oligarchies to run the show. In the antebellum South, not only did the wealthy slaveholding planters' management of the overseas marketing of this staple crop of cotton help to reinforce an unequal relationship of patrons and clients, but ultimately, and more important, their patriarchal system of slavery sustained a hierarchical world, a society that was very different from that of the northern states. The commercial institutions that were springing up in the North had few counterparts in the southern states. The South did not have the numbers of turnpikes, canals, banks, corporations, and issues of paper money that the South had. Fearing any interference with their peculiar institution, the planter-dominated legislatures kept government to a minimum. They taxed their citizens much less heavily and spent much less on education and social services than did the state legislatures of the North. Although most Southern farmers were not slaveholders, and many of the plain folk of the South thought they were working just as hard as any ambitious northern artisan, these ordinary Southern folk could never give the same kind of enterprising, middling tone to their society that existed in the North. There were fewer middling institutions in the South, fewer towns, fewer schools, fewer newspapers, fewer businesses, fewer manufacturing firms, fewer shops, and there were fewer middling people in the South, fewer teachers, fewer clerks, fewer publishers, fewer editors, fewer engineers, fewer inventors, and fewer patents. The antebellum South never became a middling, commercial-minded society like that of the North. Its patrician order of large slaveholders continued to dominate both the culture and the politics of the section. As James Madison privately admitted in the 1790s, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. As the North and South gradually grew apart, each section began expressing increasing frustration with the other, aggravating differences that had been present from the beginning of the Revolution. Northerners, especially New England Federalists, began to complain about what they saw as the unjustified Southern dominance of the federal government. They focused on the 3/5 clause of the Constitution that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for assessing representation in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. The Federalists charged that the 3/5 clause gave an unfair advantage to the Republicans and was responsible for Jefferson's election in 1800. Thus was born the idea of a slave power conspiracy that was unfairly usurping control of the national government from the free states, as so Northerners, including Lincoln, came to believe. Even more unsettling to some Northerners was the gradual realization that slavery was not dying out in the South after all. The earlier enthusiasm of the Upper South to liberalize its slave system began to dissipate, especially following the news of the slave rebellion in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, that is Haiti, in 1791. Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800 further destroyed the hopes of many that Virginia was gradually eliminating slavery. The earlier leniency in judging freedom suits in Virginia ended, and manumissions in the state rapidly declined. Southerners now began reversing their earlier examples of racial mixing. The evangelical Protestant churches ended their practice of mixed congregations. After 1800, the Southern states began enacting new sets of black codes that resembled the later Jim Crow laws, tightening up the institution of slavery and restricting the behavior of free blacks. Indeed, because free blacks seemed to threaten the slave system, they were compelled by law to leave the Southern states. The final blow to all the illusions the founders had lived with, I think, for a generation. The final blow came with the Missouri crisis in 1819. The attempt by New York Congressman James Talmadge and the House of Representatives to attach a prohibition of slavery to the bill admitting Missouri to the Union precipitated a sexual crisis more severe than anything ever felt before. Jefferson told John Adams that from the Battle of Bunker's Hill to the Treaty of Paris, we never had so ominous a question. I thank God that I shall not live to witness its issue. The Missouri crisis caused the scales to fall from the eyes of both Northerners and Southerners. The North came to realize clearly that the South was not going to abolish slavery, that it was aiming to carry the institution into the West. The South, for its part, came to realize more clearly than ever before that the North really cared about abolishing slavery and would never stop trying to end it, and certainly did not want the institution to spread to the West. From that moment, Americans clearly saw signs of a storm on the horizon, at first no bigger than a man's hand, but signs of a storm that would grow larger and more ominous every year. From that moment, I believe the Civil War became inevitable. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful address and the gift of understanding our past and understanding our origins. We appreciate it very much. And we'd like to move into the presentation of the honorary degree. Joining me on the stage are the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Catherine Albrecht, and Provost David Crego. And I will read a citation of conferral. A New York Times review of Gordon S. Wood's recent book, The Idea of America, began by noting that Professor Wood is more than an American historian. He is almost an American institution. Gordon Wood, you are the preeminent historian of the American Revolution, the Constitution, and the early American Republic. Among your many books are The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize in 1993, and The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, which won the Bancroft Prize and the John H. Dunning Prize in 1970. In 2009, your volume, Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, was published in the Oxford History of the United States series and received several major prizes. In that same year, you were awarded the National Humanities Medal by the President of the United States. You have received numerous other awards as well during your long and distinguished career. Respected for your scholarship and your commentary, you regularly contribute reviews to the New York Review of Books and the New Republic. You are also a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Professor Wood, you are the Alva O. Way University Professor and Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University, where countless students have benefited from your superb teaching. You received a BA degree from Tufts University and a PhD from Harvard University. You taught at Harvard and at the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. Ohio Northern University is honored to recognize you as an eminent scholar and teacher whose work reveals that the eras of the Revolution, the Constitution, and the early Republic are among the liveliest in American history. Because of your scholarship, the origins of America are better understood by subsequent generations. Gordon Wood, you are not almost, but are truly an American institution. Upon the recommendation of the Ohio Northern University faculty and by the authority vested in me from the state of Ohio and the university's Board of Trustees, I am delighted to confer upon you the Doctor of Humane Letters degree with all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities pertaining thereto. Congratulations.